It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. You can find me directly by emailing me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. But I also have a website called emailrevealer.com. And you can go there and do little online searches, locates and stuff like that, asset searches. We are talking today to Joe Kisner. He runs a Facebook page called Minnesota Legend Hunters, and he's been fascinated with a cold case going on there in, I think, North Dakota. And he's been looking into this thing, and there seems to be connections even to the Maury Terry, Ultimate Evil, Son of Sam cult. So we're going to get right into this right away. Mr. Joe Kisner, are you there?
Yes, I am, Ed. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. Tell us about yourself. Who is Joe Kisner?
I'm just... you might say your average Joe. I'm a supervisor for public transit in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I started that Minnesota Legend Hunters page, probably about 10 years ago as a project for my daughter and I. What we do is go out and we never had a lot of money to travel and explore all the interesting aspects across the country, so we focused on things that were happening in our own backyard, mysterious murders, disappearances, pre-Columbian visits from the Vikings, all kinds of stuff like that. And where I ran into this missing persons stuff is I had planned on trying to write a travel log book, a self-published thing with all the little events and people and stuff in Minnesota that people could actually use while they're traveling. And jumping, putting the cart ahead of the horse, I thought, well, gee, you need a follow-up from that to keep things moving. And I started, I thought Minnesota missing persons would be kind of interesting because I've always been, murders have never got me, but the mystery of those who are missing always intrigued me.
Yeah, I tell you, I did a couple of cross-country road trips, and I do quite a few north and south road trips. And sometimes you drive through these little towns, and they're so isolated, and you could just, there has to be so many people just held captive in these rural homes that are deep in the woods and deep on farms. And it just struck me so many times. You can just imagine just the kind of the family abuse, domestic abuse that goes on in these homes, so rural and away from the world, isolated. In this case you discovered, okay, who went missing?
Well, I'll bring you up to how I kind of got on that a little bit. Once I started researching the missing persons book, I found a case that was pretty close to home. It wasn't anything too dramatic. And as I started interviewing people for that, they referred me to another one of the women in there referred me to another woman whose grandmother went missing in Becker County back in 1975, named Milda McQuillan. And as I started researching that, the another family that had been become associated with her through the Becker County missing persons thing also asked if I'd care to examine their missing father. And this was back in April 3rd of 1976 in Wolf Lake, Minnesota. Bernard Rusness and Peggy McKay went missing after a house fire where their 8-year-old son died. And I don't know if you want me to get into it or what, but it's as a private citizen trying to find information on a cold criminal case, it's kind of interesting.
Well, clarify for me. Bernard Rusness went missing, or the 8-year-old boy went missing?
Well, on the Bernard Rusness and his common-law wife, as they refer to her, Peggy McKay, lived in a farmhouse outside of Wolf Lake, Minnesota. And the night of April 3rd, a neighbor drove by the house at about 11 p.m. and saw that there was flames in a basement window. She turned around and drove back to the city of Wolf Lake to notify the fire department. And in the meantime, there was a group of 6 young people driving up Highway 43 who noticed flames off in the distance and pulled off the highway down the gravel road and came up to the house. As they approached the house, they noticed that the driveway, this is early April in Minnesota, so a lot of things are pretty mushy, especially gravel driveways. And earlier in the day, apparently Bernard had basically turned the driveway or tilted up to help it dry. And as they pulled in the driveway, they noticed there was no ruts in the road, indicating anybody had driven on it since then. And as they turned to the house, they noticed flames coming out of the northern upstairs window and out of the roof line. And the time they gave for this was also about 11 p.m. The 2 men in the car tried to open the door to the house, found it locked, and the heat was extraordinary. So they went over to the LP tank, shut it off to prevent an explosion. And this time there was flames coming out one of the upstairs windows. They looked in the house and didn't see anybody. They did notice that there was 3 vehicles in the driveway, one with the hood open. And they turned around, drove back to town to try to notify the fire department, and found out that they were already on their way. And to shorten up part of this, the fire department responded. By the time they got out there, 2 of the walls of the home were down, and it basically went into a defensive mode. Later on, the deputy, Clarence Powers, came out to the house. He lived fairly close at about 12:30. And their dispatch had said the neighbors had asked if they knew where the occupants of the house were and that they should have been home. And at that time, they realized that they probably had a fire death, and they called up the state fire marshal's office. In going through the as the fire burned down, they noticed a skull in the northeast corner of the house, of the remains. As the fire marshal tried to pick it up too, even though it fell apart on him, there was only parts of it left. He also noticed I'm no arson investigator, but he also noticed that there was red and blue flames and green flames around that same area.
And that was the skull of the 8-year-old boy?
No, actually. That following day, they found the remains of the 8-year-old boy. There was basically just the upper torso had, and I believe, an arm that was intact.
Do we know who the skull belonged to then?
No.
Okay.
There's
so it could have either been Bernard or Peggy then, right?
Well, there's things that came up a little bit later. A relative of Peggy's said that Peggy's mom had given them a skull that they bought as a novelty to use as a planter. But later, not to cut around a little bit, later on I found Peggy's sister outside Seattle, Washington. And I had some other questions to ask her, but the one thing that she brought up that I didn't even talk about is she said that the skull has always bothered her, and that she said there is no way her mother would have ever given Peggy something like that. She said her mother would faint at a pulled tooth. So apparently it was a distant relative that mentioned the skull as a planter who she stated was a busybody and wanted to insert herself into the story.
So the remains of Bernard and Peggy were never recovered?
No, they were never recovered. All the vehicles were still in the driveway. To go...
Well, let me ask you this, Nan. Was this a volunteer fire department?
Yes, there was approximately 9 firefighters, including the chief, on scene.
Right. Okay, so is it possible, you think, that maybe these were just amateurs who couldn't find the remains?
And the state fire marshal, the deputy, and a group of deputies, and I think the game warden, they all went through and they screened the entire fire scene to sort of. They found coins, they found, jewelry in their screening. They did find like some fragments of other bones, but nothing. Through the coroner's report, the coroner determined that there was only one body in the fire, and that was of Bernard Rusness.
The 8-year-old boy.
Yes.
And now, you mentioned that you found a skull. Was there any other kind of like occult ritual material in the home?
Not that they discovered at that time. And that's kind of I didn't think a lot of the skull to begin with. But, as you progress through things, things start to pile up in certain directions. Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Bernard, what did he do for employment? How was he employed?
Bernard worked primarily in car dealerships. I think he was basically a body guy. He had worked at several places in the Fargo area. Where this happened is probably about an hour away from Fargo, inside the Minnesota border. And he worked in the Twin Cities for a few years prior to that at various dealerships.
And what about Peggy? Was she employed?
At the time, Peggy was working for a Twin Cities auto salvage in Fargo.
Okay.
Bernard had worked there just prior to her starting, and he went on to work with a Chevrolet dealership at that time.
Any criminal history for these two?
Well, I don't think they'd ever be canonized, but they weren't.
I was just about to ask you about canonization.
Yeah.
Yeah, but beat me to that later.
There is Bernard. It's hard to find anything definitive. The only one that really knew Bernard well was his son, which was 27, Bernard III, Ben, as they called him, who was about 27 at the time of the fire. Ben worked, I believe, at that Offutt Chevrolet at the same time his father did.
Did you talk to Ben?
Not at this time. I do have his number, but okay. I'm still trying to compile a few more things so that I don't, I have everything put together when we talk. Bernard, let's put it this way. Bernard was married and lived in Fargo with his wife, and they had 4 children, this Bernard III being the oldest. In 1966, there's a report that he had been seeing Peggy at a bar called the Silver Tray in Fargo. Peggy's husband came into the ber with a shotgun, and they ended up wrestling it away from him, and there was police reports, but there was no charges ever filed with it. And in 1966, according to statements from his wife, is about the time he left the home. Now, unfortunately, I really can't speak to his character. I can just speak to the facts. Bernard had 4 children with his wife, Margaret. He had 5 more children with a woman from Frazee, Minnesota. And then between, I think, 1961 and 1966. And then he had Brian with Peggy in 1967.
So 10 kids?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what about them? Were they churchgoers? What kind of associations did they have? Friendships? Did you run across any other people who knew them? Friends?
There's some statements in there. They said that Peggy, some of the neighbors said that they did go to Bible classes and stuff with Peggy, but they were very private people. Actually, everybody thought they were actually married. They had lived, the farm that they lived in was actually Peggy's parents'. And her brother George inherited the house in the farm place, and he basically let them live there for renovations and stuff because he didn't want the house sitting empty in fear of vandalism and things.
Now, what aroused your suspicion? You sent me some letters you received from a prisoner. Is that when things really started became suspicious?
Well, if I could backtrack when
Sure.
you start the fire scene itself. Now, when you talked about Bernard's friends, there was a guy named Ray Marsh who said he had knew Bernard for over 20 years, and they interviewed him, and he said that Bernard would have never left the trucks open. When the fire department got there, one of the fire department personnel said that he found keys in all three vehicles. There was keys left in the padlock to the well house, and next to the house he had what he called a gun shed where he worked and repaired guns and collected guns. That was also open. And Ray stated that Bernard would have never. He was the kind of guy who locked every door behind him. And which kind of brings up a few questions. That this happened at about 11 p.m. at night. The sunset around that time was about 6:55 p.m. And at the time, at 6:55, Bernard probably should have had everything closed up, locked up, and back in the house. So it's interesting that whatever happened probably initiated before 6:55 p.m. And then what I also found curious is that both times were approximate, but the first lady that drove by found the fire coming out of the basement window on the north side of the house. And by the time the other car got there, the house was basically in flames had shot up into the ceiling. Now, I don't know, with older homes like that were usually made of balloon construction, so a fire that was set in the basement basically can follow the voids through the walls because there's no fire blocks in those older houses.
Well, let me ask you this, Joe, because the way you describe the scene with all the keys, it seems like someone went to the gun shed, they went to the well, they went to the cars, and so someone was searching for something, or a group of people were there searching for something. Would the Kisners have any wealth or any kind of valuables, or drugs, or paraphernalia, anything?
The Rusnesses, no. And what was implied, because Bernard was working on his vehicles earlier that day, and the hood was open on one of his trucks. And what they had thought is that Bernard had opened up everything, but never closed them back up. So it be that somebody came onto the farm place earlier in the day before sunset, before Bernard would have packed things up, and maybe perhaps initiated whatever happened. He, with the fire too, the fire can travel and it did travel very quickly from the corner of the basement up to the roof line in a matter of minutes. So what I always thought was curious is that fire, unless it would have been like an old rig in the basement, filled with paint thinner or something, that fire traveled rather quickly. And the matter, that it was only a few minutes from the initial person seeing the fire in the corner of the basement so it was curious as to when maybe the fire might have been set, how long prior to the arrival of the first person. And another curious thing, when the 6 young people pulled up in their car, in one of the statements, I've spoke with 4 of the 6 I've tracked down. In one of the statements, one of the women, there was 4 women that were nursing students at the time at from St. Cloud, Minnesota. She stated as the men went up trying to get into the house, 2 dogs came up to her, and she scratched their head, and then they ran off, and she walked up to see if she could do anything to help. In a cold case investigation by the Minnesota BCA in 2006, they interviewed a firefighter, and he was describing the scene that they found. And it was curious enough that in that he said that he found 2 dogs locked up in the barn. So it kind of makes you wonder that if with the initial contact with the 6 people coming up to the house to begin with, having the 2 dogs out there, and then later having the two dogs locked in the barn if maybe the perpetrator could have still been on the property at the time and secured the dogs in the barn. So that's just kind of there's all kinds of little things like that that try to make you think about what exactly could have happened.
Well, let me ask you a question. Do you think that the Russman and his wife Peggy, do you think they're alive? Are alive today? Are there been sightings of them?
Yeah, there was actually there was some sightings. There was 3 or 4 of them. One in a truck stop in Paynesville, Minnesota, which is probably about an hour away from there. Another more curious one, a couple stated that on Memorial Day that year, they were out fishing, and they stated Bernard and Peggy pulled up. Peggy, the 2 women fished for a while, and the men drank beer in the car, and supposedly Bernard had said he'd been working doing carpentry work. Now, the notes in this file are basically a pile of handwritten notes for the most part. And I could not determine, and this was actually written on the back of an envelope. And I did track down the man that was supposedly met Bernard, but I haven't been able to make contact with him or find a good phone number yet.
And Joe, the thing is, now the sightings, are these people who previously knew Russman and McKay, or are they just from news accounts from the newspapers and stuff?
Well, that's what I was going to try to find out. The other ones were basically people that saw newspaper accounts and had the familiar look. It's unclear whether or not this couple actually knew Bernard and Peggy. The way it's stated on there is that they were familiar with them, but I can't say for sure, because if I could verify that would mean a lot right there. And there was another sighting of possibly Bernard in Moorhead, Minnesota, which basically is right across the river from Fargo. There was a Vegas station wagon, I believe it was, on the street, and a woman pulled up alongside of it, and her kids were staring at the guy driving the car. Bernard had a fake eye, and it drooped a bit, and the kids were kind of staring at the driver of this car. And she caused her to look over, and it looked as if he had the droopy eye and stuff, and she said it looked to be Bernard Rusness. And curiously enough, about 2 weeks prior to the disappearance, there was a 1972 Vega that went missing from Offutt Chevrolet, where Bernard and his son had worked. I never found any follow-up information on that. Of course, the Fargo police don't keep hot files from 45 years ago. But I thought that was a curious point there. And also, this is where Peggy's sister, Sally, lived probably 5 or 6 blocks away from where this sighting was. That's what caused me to track her down in Seattle now, just to ask her if she had any contact with Peggy after the fact, and if maybe Bernard had dropped Peggy off to visit her sister quick and tie up some loose ends. And that's where she brought up, she swears she never had any contact with anyone after that fact, and I believe her. And that's where she had mentioned the part about the skull not coming from their mom. And so those are, and there was also a letter in there from the sheriff's office to there was a large earthquake in California back in like 1980 or something, Canagla or something like that. Anyway, there was coverage on the Today Show of this earthquake, and a resident of Detroit Lakes swear they saw Peggy McKay as one of the victims getting medical treatment. Her hair was a different color, but they swore that was her. And there was a letter written to the sheriff's office out there asking them to look into it. But again, I never found anything documenting any resolution as to whether or not they did go through it. I did try contacting NBC and their video archives, and unless you're, a professional, they won't even talk to you about that.
So now, Joe, you sent me some letters from a guy in prison, right? And one of them talks about how he saw. No, there was another witness who saw he was fishing, and he saw a guy in a white robe and a little boy in a white robe. Now, do you think that's possibly was Bernard and his son?
This would have been about 4 years after.
Okay.
With that came up during the BCA's cold case investigation. So I know we're running out of time here, and we'll kind of cut to the chase a little bit. The part that brought me to you in your work, when I initially sat down with the Becker County Sheriff a few years back, prior to this, with my doing some research for Minnesota Legend Hunters, I came across some things for Becker County in the Vergas area, talking about somebody posted a report talking about white hooded figures that lurk through the woods and in the ditches. And when I met with the sheriff, I wasn't thinking of anything connected, possibly. I had joked with him, we're about the same age, and he had mentioned, when I mentioned the white hooded people, he said that was they were very familiar with them back in high school, and it was something that was talked about a lot in the area. I found a couple newspaper accounts that mentioned them, nothing solid, but just mentioned them in passing and kids being scared. And the following day after I met with the sheriff, I met with one of Rusness's sons. And in passing, I had mentioned the white sheet people to him as well. And he was very familiar with the story. And he said he believed at one time he actually came across their compound in the woods when they were out four-wheeling. And said it's since burned down, to his knowledge. So we go back to this letter. What you're referring to is there was a gentleman who was interviewed by the BCA agent that was doing the cold case investigation. It started out where he thought he snagged a flannel shirt in Wolf Lake at one time and thought maybe it might be related. But in the last paragraph, just in passing, he mentions being out fishing in about 1980 with his brother and his sons, and he hears somebody yell, "Daddy, Daddy," on the shoreline. They look up and they see two robed figures with lanterns on the shoreline. By the time they got back to shore, they had both figures had disappeared or left the scene. It was just kind of thrown out there as an odd statement. It kind of made me think, because it wasn't anything I was thinking about involved with this case. And then we moved to the letters I shared with you. There was a letter from a gentleman named Terry M., just the initial M, that came from the North Dakota State Penitentiary. In this letter, he stated that another inmate, who he called Reverend Bob Warner, was an exorcist, and there was people out trying to kill him because he was wrongfully convicted of something, of course. And these people were scared of him because he was an exorcist. That he had knowledge of the boy dying in Wolf Lake, as well as a woman going missing from McCluskey, North Dakota, a pregnant woman who supposedly this devil cult had killed and chopped up and put someplace. This letter was forwarded to the BCA agents that were working back then. And incidentally, I did contact the sheriff's office up in McCluskey and spoke with the chief deputy, and he spoke with older officers, and they've never had a missing pregnant woman up there. So I'm not sure where that comes from.
And there was a note attached with that too. I think the jails department, the prisons department there said, well, this guy is often associating himself with crimes.
Yeah, and the guy that, not Terry M. so much as the guy he was referring to.
Oh.
And digging through the notes, like I said, there's literally a pile of chicken scratch notes in this file. I did come across a sheet of paper with just some names written on it, showing that the BCA agents did talk to this Warner at one point, and it appears that he gave them two names. And I also ended up looking to them. But Warner wrote a response September the next year stating he wanted to speak with the BC agents again and how he apologized for not cooperating. He stated, how can he prove his innocence when he's not telling the truth about this? He said he had direct knowledge of who was involved with the Wolf Lake fire and the death of the boy. And he also mentioned something about a contracted hit put out on a woman who I later found out to be the daughter of the then Governor Guy of North Dakota. In my research, I researched Bob Warner quite a bit. He's still alive. He lives under an alias in Mandan, North Dakota right now. I've not been able to get a hold of him or find contact for him, but I did confirm that he lives there with a detective in Mandan. This man has quite the history of cons. I actually found his ex-wife out in Montana, who was married to him at the time, who has a healthy fear of him, and she said she celebrates their divorce every year by buying herself something nice. But I've always believed that there's an element of truth even in some of the biggest lies. So I tried to vet the guy out a little bit. I did find the governor's daughter. She lives here in Minnesota. I imagine calling somebody up after 40 years and asking them if they were aware that there was potentially a hit put out on them back in the 70s. She had told me that she, at that time, was working as a confidential informant for the North Dakota Drug Enforcement Agency, and that she helped put plenty of people in prison at that time. So she wasn't aware of anything like that, a hit coming out, but it was well within reason that somebody may have done that. So there was my little element of truth in there.
Yeah, that's interesting. So she was working as an informant for the DEA.
For the North Dakota Drug Enforcement Bureau.
Okay, do we know what the nature of that case was?
There were actually several that she worked on, and I believe it was in conjunction, or she worked in conjunction with them after getting herself into a little bit of trouble too.
Okay. Now what about? What was the connection? Because you joined the Maury Terry group. Did you find any connections between this situation here and the North Dakota cult?
Well, that's where I was trying to. One of the rabbit trails I was going down is researching cults in the area at that time. And of course, when you start looking at newspapers, Maury Terry's name popped up. And with a lot of the stuff going on in North Dakota back in about the same time frame, I'd also talked to, I have associates that worked in Bismarck at that time, and stated that she actually worked in the jail at that time, just becoming a sworn officer. And she stated that there were deputies that actually came across ceremonies out in fields that they really had no reason, they couldn't really do anything about it, but and stated that there was all kinds of activity going around at that time. And so I started researching more of, Maury Terry and the process, or the Process Church, as being probably the most prolific back then. So basically where I'm grasping at straws now is trying to find names and make connections. The two names that Warner gave in his statement to the BCA initially were involved in a armed robbery of a Fargo hospital pharmacy, and I actually spoke with one of the gentlemen. The other gentleman's deceased, and he has vague recollections of Warner, remembering he was quite the talker and thought that he was in prison for murder, which I guess he, according to his ex-wife, he liked saying that, but it was actually more like check fraud. But there's so I'm kind of grasping at straws, looking for names as far as that goes, trying to put pieces together. And when we go back to the farm place, about a year and a half prior to the fire, there was a cattle mutilation on the farm.
Really? The same farm?
Yep.
Rusness farm?
Yep, Rusness's farm. And, well, basically they found a mutilated calf with the organs removed on a brush pile. They did not have cattle. I'm not sure exactly where it came from. I did find a couple other vague references in newspapers up in Becker County regarding some cattle mutilation stuff. And if you look back, I started looking into that aspect of it. And back during the mid to late 70s, there was a rash of cattle mutilations going across Minnesota, bits of Wisconsin, bits of South and North Dakota. A doctor, I know some of your listeners might be familiar with Dr. J. Allen Hynek.
Yeah.
Hynek was asked by the U.S. Attorney General's office to research these mutilations. And he worked with a guy named Donald Flickinger, who was a FTA agent at the time. And they went through Minnesota and investigated these cases. And I did manage...
Did you mean to say ATF?
ATF, yeah. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
But I did track down Donald Flickinger in Montana as well. I spoke with him for a while. They were working on... at that time, it's a whole story in itself. There was people that associated them with what they call themselves as the Sons of Satan, which is, I'm not sure if it is the motorcycle group or if it's a separate entity. And there was 2 inmates from Oklahoma, one in Texas, one in Oklahoma, that stated that their group was responsible for these mutilations, and that they actually had a list of politicians that they intended to target doing the same thing. And Donald Flickinger actually, it was funny, I read a reference to it, and I asked him, he woke up one morning at his house up in the Twin Cities suburb, and he had the word "stop" written in blood on his garage door.
Really?
It was kind of funny. He blew it off, but I'm going, that's kind of crazy stuff, man, you know.
Let me ask you this. Back to the white sheets.
Mm-hmm.
Did they have a reputation for any kind of violence or ritual abuse? What were they up to? What was this group focused on?
Nobody really knows, and I've been trying to determine, you know, were they some kind of druid outfit or something that did stuff? Supposedly they would come out of ditches and attack cars. That could be, you know, just teenage folklore too. I did. There were some strange religious groups up there at the time. There was one called something similar to Inner Light Ministries. It's kind of different because they're back in the 70s. There was early 80s, late 70s. There was a hitchhiker strangled down in southern Minnesota and found in a ditch along the highway. They never identified her. Well, back, I believe, in the late 80s, a man in a Texas prison confessed to the murder. Well, this guy was a Minnesota State Trooper, and on duty one night, he found this hitchhiker sexually assaulted and strangled her. And shortly after that event happened, he relocated to the Detroit Lakes area, which is near Wolf Lake, with the State Patrol. And he joined this Church of the Inner Light. And shortly thereafter, quit his job as a trooper, packed up his family, and moved with the church to Texas. So that's another. However, I don't know if it was them, if it would be a group like that, and they were involved in some kind of maybe communal exercise wearing white robes. But it's really hard to say. And I know I'm not giving your listeners much of conclusions on anything, but I'd be willing to lend an ear to anyone that has any knowledge of anything going on back then.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask you, because you're going to have a lot of people listening. You know, what kind of information, tips, and sources are you looking for in that area?
Well, I'm looking primarily right now. I do have a person of interest that I believe is at least has knowledge of the event. However, I have nothing that can. I won't mention it because I have nothing that connects that person to these things. But I'm really interested in names that could have been involved in the northern Minnesota, North Dakota area, and like on the group, the Maury Terry group, trying to find, make those connections behind the scenes, and to come back and maybe connect with people involved on the back end of it. That's really about all I can do right now. I think if I could ever get a hold of the inmate Warner, I think it would resolve a lot of questions. But unfortunately, the phone number I have for him is disconnected, and I don't have the time or the money to drive up to North Dakota and go knock on some doors.
Did you do any online searches to see if he has a new number?
Oh, yeah. I've done
Okay.
All kinds of stuff. And this guy has lived under aliases as well. He's living under an alias now. I did find his son, who has a name similar to his. I did reach his son, who I did confirm that with a detective from Mandan, but his son denied any knowledge of Warner, denied any knowledge of his own mother, said he's never heard of them, even though they have a very unique last name that they share. So I just left the door open for him to give me a call back if he ever discovered anything.
And again, the fellow with the disconnected number, did you try sending him a letter?
If I've got two addresses, and I guess if I knew it was good, that wouldn't be a bad idea. I guess in this digital age, we forget about the pen and paper.
And you can always send a letter. Many times when I'm working on something, you'll come up with 4 or 5 different possible name matches. It's a common name. You just send out 4 or 5 letters. You'd have copy machines these days. You can just make a copy of the letter, and you send it out to 5 addresses. A lot of people complain too when you do a locate and you come back with more than one address. People complain, well, I got to know exactly which one. Mail to all of them, man. That's the big deal.
I'll have to say this is something that's fairly new to me.
Yeah.
And I'll have to say I've had remarkable luck in people's willingness to talk to me and in locating people. And it's something that you found. There's a lot of things with this case where people said the police dropped the ball, yada, yada, yada. There was even suspicions that the deputy investigating was involved with it, which was not. I'm quite confident about that. But everything I've done has been built off the shoulders of those initial investigations. And there's so many rabbit trails to go down that I think people get burned out, and they don't want to follow any more empty leads. And that's basically where I've been doing my exploring, trying to find some clarity. My initial objective, I told the family, and I've been blessed that a couple of these families have trusted me enough to look into this and give me the information I need. But my main goal was to eventually put out the true factual story of what's going on, because you go on today on the internet, in Reddit and internet sleuths and stuff, there's so much conjecture, and a lot of the conjecture is taken off of things that aren't even factual to the case, and you end up having a thread that's 10 pages long about something that never really happened.
Yeah, I have to admit, I've done that myself. You hear something repeated so many times, you just assume someone's verified it and checked it out, and you repeat it. The next thing you know, you find out years later, it's wrong. Wasn't right information. And I agree with you, too, about this thing about people are hesitant to contact witnesses or people involved with something. People are usually very willing to talk to you. If they know something, everyone's just like your next-door neighbor. They're not this scary kind of person that's going to start yelling at you. It's just, if people want to talk, people want to help, especially if you start off, hey, can you give me some help? Can you help me out? People, the first instinct is they want to help.
And you know what? And to be perfectly honest, I am not any kind of law enforcement or private investigator. I'm just a guy trying to assist a family, and it's nice. People, you be forward with them, and I've had people extensive conversations with people that were more than happy to give me their recollections and their thoughts on this, and give me some more trails to run down.
Well, Mr. Joe Kisner, I got to tell you, you got a great voice for radio. I predict you'll have a podcast within a month. And when you call these people up, you can tell them you're working on your podcast. But people can follow Joe Kisner at Minnesota Legend Hunters. And we're talking about the case here of Bernard Rusness and his wife, Peggy McKay. Joe Kisner, if any new information comes up, hit me up and we'll touch base again.
Sounds good. Yeah, there's all kinds of other little trails to go down, but I do appreciate the opportunity, Ed, and hopefully didn't bore your listeners too much.
Definitely not. Thank you so much. Good night.
All right, bye.